Fragmentation is pervasive. It has two basic components. One is habitat loss, but then it's also the apportionment of that remaining land in smaller and more isolated pieces. Especially for animals that require a lot of area, they can't sustain a population in those little pieces. So fragmentation basically drives them to extinction.
Welcome to Wildlife Outdoors with your host, Russell and Jose. If you have a passion for conservation of the outdoors, or you're enjoying a calming hike in the mountains, an exhilarating kayak trip on the river, feeling a fish on the end of your line, cooking on an open flame in a primitive campsite, or stalking big game, just waiting for the perfect shot, you're in the right place. So put on your boots and polarized sunglasses and come along for the ride.
Welcome back to another episode of Wildlife Outdoors. Today we're joined by Dr. Reed Noss, one of the most influential conservation biologists of our time. His work on landscape ecology, large mammal conservation, and wildlife corridors has helped shape how we think about protecting ecosystems. From bears and panthers to the connected wildlands they depend on, Dr. Noss brings decades of science-driven insight into what it truly takes to conserve wildlife for the long term. Welcome to Wildlife Outdoors, Dr. Noss. How you doing?
Thanks a lot, Russell. I'm glad to be here.
Hey, I'm excited to have you on here, but it's weird how I kind of came across you. So I heard about all of the stuff going on with the Florida black bears, and the first season was in 2025, the first season since 2015, I believe it was, and started trying to do research to see if I could talk to somebody about it. And I didn't realize that there was so many activist groups protesting and things of that nature going back and forth. And as I was looking into it, I started seeing that your name would pop up here and there just based on conservation and wildlife in Florida. And so I was like, well, why not just go to the origin of it? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about black bears in general. But I would like to start with your body of work and, you know, where you started and just learn more about you before we dig into that issue. So if you could give a brief introduction to yourself and some of the body of work that you have, that would be great.
Well, sure. I've had a varied career, as you alluded to. I actually started out in environmental education. I taught in an outdoor school in Ohio. And then I decided I wanted to do a little more research and take more of a science route to my career. So I ended up going to University of Tennessee and getting a master's degree. Worked for a while in the tropics. I came back and did I actually was going to get a PhD, but I had a couple things fall apart in terms of research. Like I was in Nicaragua, for example, when the latest revolution started back in 1978, and I had to leave a PhD project there. So
Wow.
I ended up studying birds in Ohio, in an area I was familiar with. Then I worked for the Ohio Department of Natural Resources as an ecologist for several years, and decided I wanted to go back and try to get that PhD. I took a contract job in Florida with Florida's Heritage Program called Florida Natural Areas Inventory. It was a 9-month contract, but it was perfect. It gave me state residency so I could then get lower tuition rate going to a Florida university. And I was looking at University of Florida and a guy there named Larry Harris, who was also a major figure in corridors, or was. He died a few years ago, but ended up getting a PhD at the University of Florida. And then I took a job with the US EPA in Oregon. Worked that job a couple of years and didn't really like it. It was too bureaucratic, too political. There were things we weren't allowed to say, I don't take censorship very well. So I quit that job, but I got another half-time job at the University of Idaho, and then worked as editor of the journal Conservation Biology, which was a half-time job as well. And so things worked out.
Wow.
And I was there about 14 years in Oregon, and then started to think, well, I need a little more security perhaps. So I think I'll look for an academic job. And I was invited to apply for a distinguished professor job at the University of Central Florida, which is in Orlando. And I got that job, and I was there for 15 years. Until I kind of burned out on that. Again, the bureaucracy got too much for me. So now I'm employed half-time by University of Florida, which is where I got my PhD, in the Center for Landscape Conservation Planning, working on basically the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which is work I was doing in Florida back in the 80s. So it's kind of come full circle back to some of that same work.
That's awesome. So I do have a few notes here. I've watched a couple podcasts that you were on and just tried to learn more about you to kind of, for ease of conversation here. And I do see in my notes that it says that you and Larry Harris developed the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. So what exactly is that?
So it's a little more complicated than that. We didn't call it the Florida Greenways Network at the time.
Okay.
We just called it Larry called it landscape linkages, and he pointed to some specific landscape linkages, which are large connecting corridors between existing conservation areas. For example, one very important one we called attention to was between the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge, where coincidentally I'm doing a lot of work right now, trying to get the area designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But a connection between there and the Osceola National Forest in Florida, which is just to the south. And most of that linkage has been completed now. At the time, it was just a kind of a far-fetched dream, but the Nature Conservancy, the Conservation Fund in particular, bought a lot of land, and we have a corridor that we're trying to add to still, but between the Okefenokee and the Osceola. But back in the 80s, I decided, why don't we just do this statewide? Why don't we have an entire statewide Florida wildlife corridor? And at the time, I just called it a Florida Ecological Network. And then later on, well, about 10 years later, a guy named Tom Hochter, who's my boss now at University of Florida, but he was a grad student also with Larry Harris. He's about 10 or so years younger than I am. He came up with the actual, by name, Florida Ecological Greenways Network, beginning in 1997.
Okay.
And it still exists. And what's now called the Florida Wildlife Corridor represents the top 3 priority lands within the Florida Ecological Greenways Network. But what it is, it's a statewide system of core areas, which are existing conservation areas, and proposed corridors to connect them. And so It's 18 million acres, the Florida Wildlife Corridor, for example, and about 10 million acres are protected. And we're trying to get the additional 8 million protected. And just by stroke of luck, we had a guy named Carlton Ward, who's a wildlife photographer, who organized what he called the Florida Wildlife Corridor Expedition. And they did basically a combination of hiking, canoeing, and biking from the Everglades all the way to the Okefenokee to demonstrate the need for this kind of corridor and the possibility of it. And because of Carlton and a few other people, that became part of the state law. In 2021, the Florida legislature unanimously passed a bipartisan bill, and that never happens in Florida. Florida is very heavily divided, like most of the U.S. right now, but we got this bipartisan bill to establish the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And the state's been providing about $500 million a year, which is actually about what they were providing during the 1990s. And then it slipped for a while, and now it's back on. So piece by piece, we're prioritizing what are the most important linkages, the most important actual parcels to add to the Florida Wildlife Corridor. That's amazing. What a lot of my job is now, is working with people to do models of wildlife movement, wildlife habitat suitability, and so on, to figure out what those priorities should be.
That's amazing.
It's a long process.
It sounds like it. So I have 2 kind of questions, one of them relating to photography. So you brought in a photographer and he did the expedition, but you dabble in photography too, don't you?
I do. I do a lot of photography. I'm semi-professional. I don't actively try to sell photos. I have sold a few, and I've published a lot of my own photos in my own publications. And I've given a lot away, for free to friends who are doing books or articles where they need photos. So, and I still, that's something that I love to do. It's something I might try to do more professionally, perhaps in the future.
Mhm.
when I have time.
Right. It sounds like you
It
have
takes a lot of
pretty
time
tight schedule.
a lot of people do nature photography and wildlife
Yeah.
photography.
Yeah.
So you really got to be not only good, but you have to really market yourself. And I haven't really tried to do that as a photographer yet, but maybe sometime.
Awesome. Yeah, I dabble in photography myself. I do more of a sports photography thing just because what you said, nature photographers they're everywhere. Everybody, the first thing they do when they get a camera is they want to shoot nature. And there's just so many people out there. And some people are amazing at marketing themselves. I am
Yes.
not that guy. So
Yeah, me
I
neither.
dabble with, nature photography just as a hobby because I see stuff that I like. But majority of what I do is sports photography. But did you go along on that expedition?
I did not. I did not even know Carlton Ward and the other leading person, Mallory Dimmitt, who's with now director of the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation, which is a nonprofit to promote the Florida Wildlife Corridor. Um, I did not know Mallory, but another guy involved, Joe Guthrie. Um, he works now for Archibald Biological Station, and I did know Joe because he was the student of an old friend of mine, David Mayer. And Dave Mayer and I were friends back in the 80s when I was a student at UF, and he also got his PhD with Larry Harris. And Dave and I and one other guy co-edited a book published back in 2001 on large mammal restoration, a series of chapters on restoring populations of large mammals across North America.
Oh, wow.
And tragically, Dave, it's been about 10 years ago now, he died in a small plane crash. He was up radio tracking black bears,
Really?
and the pilot made an error. It crashed, and they both died. Unfortunately, that was a big loss.
And it sounds like it. That's tough. So obviously y'all have done a lot of work with large mammals, and I'm sure that includes ungulates and bears and the Florida panther and things of that nature. So how exactly do the corridors relate to that?
Well, large mammals, because they're big, and especially carnivores because they're meat eaters, they have enormous space requirements. They can't get by in a few thousand acres. They need, for long-term viability, literally millions of acres. And you're rarely going to find one single chunk, especially in the East. You're not going to find, single chunks of 1 million or more acres in very many places. So the only way to sustain the populations is to link together a number of separate sites by corridors. And I like to say that it's when you do that, if you do it right, you're creating a whole greater than the sum of its parts, because no single area would be big enough to maintain a viable population. But if you link together a number of sites where animals can move among them, if you do it right again, you do create something that's greater than that and might maintain a viable population, or metapopulation, which is a series of populations that are connected by occasional dispersal in the long term. And so that's really at the heart of the corridor strategy. But beyond just long-term population viability, even over smaller areas, many animals use corridors just to meet their daily and seasonal life history needs. They may spend, for example, black bears. You mentioned black bears already. In Florida, black bears shift their habitat use seasonally. In the spring and early summer, for example, they use a variety of habitats such as what we call pine savannas. In Florida, we call them pine flatwoods and pine sandhills. And then in the late summer and fall, they shift to other habitats, particularly Florida scrub, which is an oak scrub type of system because of the acorn availability, and that's their main food source. But if they're not able to move across the landscape to get from one habitat type to another, then they're stuck. So corridors promote even those seasonal and daily movements as well.
I see. That makes sense.
And
So
also small animals. A lot of the most important corridors that we're working on in Florida now are basically wildlife movement crossings, highway crossings, underpasses, overpasses in some cases, where animals can cross highways. And of course, those are narrow, constricted corridors, and you need to have fencing to kind of funnel those animals into the wildlife crossings so they can cross the roads without getting hit. So there's a lot of different types of corridors, all of which are very important for wildlife.
I see. I didn't even think about corridors on a seasonal basis. I was just thinking, mainly from large section to large section. So like studies have shown that even narrow corridors can dramatically increase like gene flow between populations as well. So not
Exactly.
only is it a daily thing or a seasonal thing, but it almost seems like a generational thing. So why is genetic exchange so crucial for species over multi-generational timescales?
Well, if a population of a species is stuck in a small area, and especially if it's an animal that needs a lot of space, that population is going to lose genetic diversity over time. And with that, they have there's problems related to inbreeding. It's a phenomenon called inbreeding depression. If you have mating between close relatives, all kinds of recessive traits show up by mutation, for example, that lead to reduced survival, reduced reproduction, and so on. You also have a phenomenon called genetic drift, where genetic variation is just lost by chance in small populations. And so, in order to restore genetic diversity, they have to mix their genes by mating with individuals from other populations, and corridors can help facilitate that. Not
I
just,
see.
again, for bears and panthers, but for small animals, snakes, turtles, even small mammals, and so on.
I see. So have you seen any successes in Florida specifically where bears and or panthers have made it to other areas due to the project that you were speaking of earlier?
Very good question. We have. Florida panthers are showing up, and predictably, when they're radio tracked, they pretty much follow the Florida Wildlife Corridor or the Florida Ecological Greenways Network.
Really?
So I guess we designed it right, but we designed it with them in mind, so they should follow it, right? But we now find panthers making it male panthers, because in mammals, males disperse further than females.
I
It's
see.
much more difficult for females to move long distances just due to inherent behavioral differences.
I see.
But we now have males showing up all the way, for example, in the Okefenokee, coming from South Florida. One male panther was shot by a hunter in northern Georgia, right on the Alabama line, not that far away from Atlanta, a few years ago. And
Really?
the hunter did the right thing. He turned in the carcass to wildlife authorities. They did the DNA testing. And sure enough, it was from the South Florida population of panthers.
Really?
And so it's corridors that allow that to happen. And not all those corridors are protected. They happen to be, corridors, a lot of people get the misimpression that we're trying to put something new on the landscape that's not already there.
Mhm.
And that happens sometimes. We try to restore a corridor that's been lost due to development, well, with developments, it's a little harder. But let's say with agriculture, you might destroy a forest that it was previously acting as a corridor. So you try to get that land protected and allow the forest to regrow. But in most cases, the corridor is already there, but it's not protected. In Florida is the fastest growing state. Again, it's averaged almost 1,000 people net growth per day, a
Wow.
1,000 people per day. And so the rate of development is just insane. So if we don't protect these corridors quickly, they're going to be lost to development. And in most cases, we're protecting these corridors. Again, they already exist by conservation easements, where the state, sometimes another entity, but in Florida, usually the state, pays the landowner, usually ranchers or timberland owners, pays them a certain amount of money for them to establish a conservation easement on their land, which restricts uses. It allows them to keep on doing what they're doing, raising cows, raising timber, but they're not allowed to develop it,
I
or at
see.
least not large scale development. They might be able to put an additional house or two, but
Mhm.
no large scale development. So that's basically the strategy, is to keep these areas safe from a large scale development, because when that happens, they lose their value for most wildlife.
I see. And that's something that I guess most people probably don't think of, because to us it almost seems like invisible. We're used to seeing roads and housing developments and fences and stuff, but those fragment the landscapes, and it's not something that comes to our minds. So from an ecological perspective, how does fragmentation affect the behavior, stress levels, survival, and even population numbers when it comes to fragmentation?
So habitat fragmentation is pervasive. It has two basic components. One is habitat loss, just the loss of habitat, but then it's also the apportionment of that remaining land in smaller and more isolated pieces. And as we just discussed, especially for animals that require a lot of area, they can't sustain a population in those little pieces. So fragmentation basically drives them to extinction. And so habitat loss and fragmentation together are the leading cause of extinction for animals and many plants as well. It takes longer for plants because they can maintain populations in much smaller areas. Same thing for most invertebrates and small vertebrates. They're able to maintain populations for decades in fairly small areas. But these large mammals, as we discussed, they require very large areas. So with fragmentation, they lose that ability to move through the landscape. So connectivity, which is the broader term for corridors, is basically the opposite of fragmentation. It's sewing together a landscape that's being broken apart.
So what's the process of that? I know you touched a little bit on it in terms of like leasing lands and stuff like that, but you do something called rewilding, right? Is that the correct term that you use?
It is, yeah.
So can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So actually, my first design for a Florida wildlife corridor, I called it one of the terms I called it was the Florida Wilderness Recovery Strategy. And wilderness recovery was later shortened by some other authors into the term rewilding. It's the same thing, but today rewilding occurs across a broad spectrum. So at the wilderness end of the spectrum, we're trying to get basically a complete food chain back into an area, for example, that's lost its large carnivores because of overhunting, often illegal hunting, poaching, or other reasons. They've lost their large carnivores, and you see changes to the food web. You see herbivores such as deer become too abundant and start to overbrowse the vegetation, which then has effects on birds and everything else that uses that vegetation structure. And so rewilding is restoring the food web. And it's in the original days, we actually had a saying, the 3 C's: cores, carnivores, and corridors. And so we focus mostly on these big areas and big animals. But now there's rewilding projects that are a little less ambitious, but still just as important. Just trying to get, in Europe especially, they're trying to rewild. They have rewilding projects that focus on the de-domestication of large herbivores. So
Really?
trying to get cows to behave more like their wild ancestors. And the main wild ancestor of cow was the aurochs, Auroch, which was much larger than our domestic cattle and fiercer. It's extinct now, but they're having some success. If you stop intensively managing cattle, they regain some of those wild characteristics, and they start to interact with the landscape in a way that's healthier for the overall ecosystem.
I see. So that's a domestication thing that I guess I didn't even think about. Yeah. Because, I mean, you think about it, bison are much larger than cattle, but yet they seem to be less destructive on the landscape. So I never even thought about that even being a thing, about domestication causing the behaviors of the cattle to change. Huh. That's something to think about for sure.
Yeah. And bison, that's another thing, in the East, we're trying to get bison back, and bison have been reintroduced into particular areas. Same with elk.
Really?
And there's a lot of projects now that are proposing to bring bison and elk back to larger areas. There's places like Land Between the Lakes in Kentucky and Tennessee, which is mostly on Tennessee Valley Authority land. And they have reintroduced it's a big fenced area, but it's, I forget the acreage, but thousands of acres. They have a herd of bison and a herd of elk that are doing well. And they have to cull some of them, harvest some of them, because they don't have the large carnivores back to control their populations.
I see.
So without large carnivores, hunting is very important to keep the populations of those large herbivores in check.
I see.
But they also play very important roles in the landscape. They serve as keystone species. Bison help increase plant diversity. And especially if you combine bison and fire, or managed right, even cattle and fire, you can help restore a lot of the native plant communities that have been degraded or lost over time.
I see.
And that is a form of rewilding as well.
And is that done through like prescribed burns and rotational grazing, or?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, because what bison do, and cattle will do the same thing to a little more limited extent, because cattle don't move as much as bison. That's one of the key differences. Cattle hang out in streams and wetlands and do damage because of that. But bison are very wide ranging. And so, and they often follow fire across the landscape if they're given a chance. So where a fire occurs, either a lightning fire or a prescribed burn, bison will move into that area, and cattle will do that too on a more limited basis, because the grass that grows up and other plants after a fire is more palatable and more nutritious. So they cue in on that. And so they will heavily graze certain areas, and then they'll move on. They won't stick around. So that grazing will be short-term. Long-term heavy grazing is very detrimental. But if they're given a chance to move, which corridors can help do, getting back to that, they maintain a more diverse or heterogeneous landscape and then there would be without the bison or the fire.
So to me, it seems like it's more of a, I guess in a way, broad management process. So a lot of people will think management in terms of populations of a singular animal in a singular location. And to me, it seems like this is more of a model that seems to be more broad, more, I guess, based on the landscape rather than the specific species, which I guess could be more beneficial. So like I've heard ecologists, describe large mammals as like an umbrella species, or like the protection benefits, the entire ecosystem rather than just the one species. So can you explain how conserving a single wide ranging species can ripple outward to protect plants, insects, smaller wildlife, and things of that nature?
Yeah, you brought up that term umbrella species, and that's a very important concept. Basically, if you conserve enough area for large mammals, especially carnivores, but also large herbivores like bison that range very widely, especially migratory herbivores. If you conserve enough area for them, you're going to bring along other native species that require less area. So everything that's native to that ecosystem that requires less area than those big mammals is going to also be able to survive if they have the right habitat availability. In those patches of habitat. So the bison or the wolf or the mountain lion or the panther, whatever, panther and mountain lion are the same thing. Cougar, puma, a lot of different names for the same animal. In fact, it's now genetic tests show that the puma, cougar, panther, mountain lion is a single subspecies across all of North America.
Really?
And they're generalists, basically. You could take a Florida panther, plop it down in British Columbia, for example, and it would do just fine, or vice versa. Because they're very adaptable if you just give them a chance and you don't shoot them and you give them enough land and enough connected land. They're very adaptable. All they need is security from human persecution, and adequate prey. Those are the two things they need. The actual habitat structure doesn't make a big difference.
Really? That's interesting. I know that, they do testing whenever they're finding mountain lions in ranges where they're not common, anymore. And here in Arkansas, we've had, I think, quite a few of them found the past few years. We actually had one that got hit by a car, I think like 15 miles from where I live. But if I'm not mistaken, I think they found some up in northwest Arkansas. I can't remember what county it was. And when they did genetic testing on it, if I'm not mistaken, I think they said that it was from like South Dakota or something like that, which I just thought was insane because that's quite a ways away from Northwest Arkansas.
It is. And in fact, even more amazing, a mountain lion from South Dakota a few years ago made it all the way to Connecticut.
Wow.
All the way to Connecticut. How
That's
it did
crazy.
that, I mean, it had to cross the Mississippi River. It had to
Yeah.
cross numerous highways. Finally, it was killed by a car in Connecticut. But I mean,
Really?
we're talking, over, what is that, a couple thousand miles?
Yeah.
They're
Literally across the country.
they can move. And that's why they're just a single subspecies. These animals before fragmentation, they would disperse over 1,000 miles sometimes. So you had
Wow.
connections, all the way across the continent.
It's crazy to think about how it could get all the way across there, not only from natural features, but all the roads and highways
Well, I mean, most would not. I mean, it was just, it lucked out. It was obviously a clever animal. It knew where to go and where not to go, just instinctively. And so it avoided roads as much as possible, crossed roads at night, probably when there was less traffic,
yeah.
and just kept away from people as much as it could and got all the way
That's
to Connecticut
impressive.
and ran out of luck.
Right. That's insane.
Now I'd like to tell you about a couple of our sponsors. First, we have Bucked Up. When you're out in the wild, whether you're stalking a trophy buck, casting for that elusive bass, or trekking through rugged terrain, you need more than just grit. You need fuel that matches your passion for the outdoors. That's where Bucked Up energy drinks and supplements come in. Crafted for those who live life on the edge, Bucked Up offers a range of products designed to enhance your performance, endurance, and recovery. From the early morning hunts to the late night fishing trips, Bucked Up has your back. Use promo code WLO20 at checkout to receive 20% off your order. Explore their full range of products by clicking on the link in the description. Next, we have Foretold Coffee Company. Start your adventure with a brew as bold as the journey ahead. Foretold Coffee Company crafts ethically sourced small batch roasts for those who find peace in the wild. Founded by Army veteran Joshua Sandoval, each cup reflects resilience, exploration, and the spirit of the outdoors. Whether it's the light Peruvian cocoa, the medium El Salvadoran bourbon, or the dark Mexican honey, each cup is perfect for the base camp mornings or fireside evenings. Subscribe to their monthly coffee club for 10% off and stay fueled for every expedition. To learn more, visit foretoldcoffeeco.com.
So I guess to kind of get back more on topic, I've seen that a lot of your previous work emphasizes thinking like decades and centuries rather than, shorter term things, or, we briefly talked about politics with bipartisan earlier, but, election cycles. And I feel like, unfortunately, now a lot of these policies are being made based on emotion and based on politics, which I think should not be a part of the equation at all. But why is long-term ecological thinking so difficult to implement in a modern society? And I know that can range into numerous things like short attention spans and social media and stuff like that. But
yeah, that is a fundamental question. People have looked at that. Psychologists have pointed out that, especially evolutionary psychologists who take into consideration evolution of humans and their behavior, that we did not evolve to think long term. We evolved to produce offspring, as many as possible, over the short term. And, what happened in future generations wasn't a concern. It was only when we started, developing philosophies and religions that thought about the ethical requirement to think about our children and grandchildren and future generations of humans in general, that we began to have the potential to at least think long term. But most people are still stuck in the short term. They can't seem to, and it's not just short term, it's also small space. I like to say we need to expand our thinking in space, time, and ambition in conservation if we're going to succeed. Most people just think about small areas over the immediate future. We need to think about centuries, millennia, because that's the scale at which evolution works, and large-scale evolution and ecological processes. So it's hard for people to do it. It takes, for most people, an ecological education, frankly. If you don't study wildlife ecology or some other science that exposes you to these phenomena and these kinds of concepts, you may never realize that you have to think over the big scales of space and time.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing that we try to do on this podcast is try to make these concepts easily digestible to the everyday person or the younger people that really don't think about it. And to oversimplify it, the way that I see it is clean water, clean air, and clean land can make a huge difference in everything. And of course, there's a lot that goes into that. But if we can get that point across to people, whether they're younger generation or people that just didn't go to college or didn't study anything to do with ecology. That's kind of like what our purpose is here is we want to have people that are educated, that do understand how everything works and try to make it more digestible. So I really appreciate you coming on for that reason. But that's really what our goal is here. And so, at its core, wildlife conservation is about making difficult and sometimes uncomfortable decisions. And so what do you think happens to wildlife when policy driven by feelings alone rather than long-term ecological data and studies?
Well, I mean, what we see happening is, maximizing profit and income is what's driving most people, and certainly corporations. They have a responsibility to their shareholders to maximize profit. And so the thinking, again, is very short term. What can we bring in, this quarter to maximize profits and dividends to the shareholders? And which, that obviously goes against ecological thinking. But, ecological education, it includes a broader ethic. It includes ethical consideration, not just for future generations and fellow humans in general, but ethical consideration for other species, for their own sake, as well as for what they can do for us. And it's really both. I mean, nature does a lot for people, but usually when you spend a lot of time outdoors and you study wildlife, almost everyone will begin to appreciate nature for its own sake and species for their own sake. And so that's an ecological ethic. And it doesn't take a college education. I mean, I mentioned earlier at the introduction that I started out in environmental education, worked at an outdoor school. And at that outdoor school, we worked mostly with sixth graders. And we taught ecology. We taught them how the land works. And we also taught them just to appreciate the wonder of nature. And so at least I like to think, well, I know that a lot of those kids did develop an ecological ethic, did become concerned with nature for its own sake. And they may have lost that later on, as they pursued business careers or whatever, which is not a bad career, but hopefully you can retain that. And I've had some wonderful experiences where just out of the blue, somebody will Facebook message me and say, hey, I think you were my camp counselor or you were my teacher back in 1975, And, I just want to say how much that did for me. And I still have those interests, like, even though I didn't go into that career, I'm still interested in nature and wildlife. And I want to thank you for that. That's just one of the most wonderful things that can happen is to know that you made a difference in terms of individuals. So we need more of that. We need more outdoor education. We need more podcasts like you're doing to awaken people to what's happening with nature and wildlife. And not everyone is going to be positively influenced. Some people think, well, I don't have time for that. You're not going to make money doing that. But I think enough people will, and in the long run, hopefully, if we don't lose everything in the short term, we may be able to succeed.
I hope so. And it's one of those things where typically, and I speak for Americans because I grew up here, and I'm sure it's a worldwide thing where humans are removed from nature and wild ecosystems in most cases. Whether they're living in the inner city or living in the suburbs, they don't have the relationship with nature and the wild that we used to. So how do you think that distance shapes public opinion on wildlife management, and what responsibility do we have as conservationists to educate them rather than just simply defend the decisions that we make and the data that we find?
Well, I mean, the existing studies and certainly my own experience show that when you do become disconnected from nature, you don't have that. You don't ever develop that ethic. You don't put that as a major priority in your life. You don't see it as a major issue when you go to vote. Most people don't go to vote with the environment as the first issue they're thinking of. I mean, I think it rates, last thing I said, like 17th or something like that. of issues people think about when they vote. I mean, that's pretty bad.
Mhm.
It's number one for me when I
Yeah.
vote. But
Same.
it's unfortunately people have become disconnected from nature. Not just in inner cities, but even in suburbs, even in the country. I live in the country now. I live out in a rural area, and some of my neighbors are environmentalists, and most of them aren't. They think about their jobs, and actually, where I live, most people apparently don't even have jobs. I think most people are on some kind of welfare. It's a
Wow.
very low income area, and so they're just trying to get by, and they unfortunately being very poorly educated. Most people around here have high school education or less. Most even didn't finish high school. There is a strong correlation between general educational level and interest in the environment. And like I say, you don't need a college degree, but it helps if you at least finish high school and get some college, because you're going to get exposed to a bigger universe of ideas. And hopefully you'll be exposed to, hopefully you take a biology course and you learn about wildlife. But yeah, we have problems with our educational system. And I think
Mhm.
that's a lot deficiencies where we just, people don't stay in school long enough. There's not the incentive to do so. They have other things that they're concerned about. And so they don't really develop that appreciation for the outdoors that you and I have, and hopefully most of your listeners.
Yeah.
But yeah, the only
Absolutely.
way to get that back is through education, at all levels, starting in early childhood. We need unfortunately, kind of the heyday of environmental education was back when I was in that field, like back in the 70s. There's much less going on these days, largely because of government cuts to environmental education programs. So we need to make it. We need again to vote with the environment in mind and try to get a lot of these programs reestablished so we can reach more kids before they lose interest. I think everybody. There's a term called biophilia, and it was coined by the biologist, very famous biologist, E.O. Wilson. Ed Wilson, he actually went by, who I knew. He was a friend of mine. He also died just a few years ago. But biophilia is a natural kind of instinctive attraction to nature. And I think everybody has it, but our society, our strongly capitalistic society, and I'm a capitalist. I mean, I have nothing against capitalism, but it's not the whole picture. But it turns that off. They lose that early interest in nature unless it's reinforced throughout their lives, and so we need that reinforcement to continue. We need kids to have mentors, their parents or teachers or others who can show them how cool nature is. And I've led kids on hikes from the inner city who've literally never been in a wild area or even semi-wild area in their life. And they may be 12 years old and they've never been out of the city. And yet most of those kids, once you get them out and you start showing them things and they experience things even on their own, they get interested. They
Yeah.
may not go into a career in that, but they regain some interest, and they hopefully will think about that when they vote and when they behave as good citizens.
Yeah. I sure hope so.
I think there's nothing else but education at
Yeah.
all levels.
Exactly. That's a big part of it. And, studies consistently show that regulated hunting funds and conservation through like licensing fees and habitat management and stuff like that, like I feel like there's a lot of people that just don't know how any of that works because, like you said, there's been a lack of education starting from a young age all the way up, in our public schools. But if those funding mechanisms disappear, because we have a lot of people that don't want people to hunt and they're trying to find regulations in order to cut hunting and stuff like that. But if those funds disappear, what replaces them? Like, what are the long-term consequences for our wildlife
Yeah.
if we are unable to hunt or do anything like that? Hunters and anglers.
Hunting has a very important role in our society. As I'm sure you know, hunting is
Mhm.
declining.
Mhm.
There are too many deer in most regions today, which is a curious phenomenon because, I mean, the white-tailed deer almost went extinct.
Yeah.
It was lost completely from most of the eastern states. It's hard to imagine that.
Yeah.
Mostly due to the deerskin trade, which started, it started like in the 1600s, but it really picked up in the 1700s. Even the Native American tribes were heavily involved in the deerskin trade because that was a way they could trade skins for, tools and metal and other implements from Europeans.
Hmm.
And so they contributed to the demise of, it wasn't all the white man that led to the demise of deer. It was everybody over hunting. And fortunately, we had a lot of early successes. And we had the Pittman-Robertson Act, which you referred to, which is where fees from hunting go into conservation programs. And we established state fish and game departments. And we established the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We passed a variety of laws of the Lacey Act of 1900, which prohibited interstate commerce in wildlife and basically stopped market hunting. And market hunting was including deerskin trade, but also the passenger pigeon. The passenger pigeon was market hunted to extinction right around the turn of the century. The last wild passenger pigeons went extinct right before the year 1900, about 1899. And then the last one died in a zoo, Cincinnati Zoo, in 1914. It was once the most abundant bird in the world. Hard to imagine that in the early 19th century, it was the most abundant bird. End of the 19th century, it was extinct in the wild.
That's insane. I mean, similar story to the American bison too, though.
Yeah.
I mean, there's pictures of mounds of hundreds of thousands of bison skulls piled up together.
I know. I saw it. It's terrible.
It is. So kind of going further into that same point, between understanding the Pittman-Robertson Act and how it's a self-imposed tax that hunters have put on themselves in order to preserve these things, there's a lot of people out there that don't understand how a lot of conservation works. And in 2025, there was large protests and rallies and things around the state of Florida based on the black bear hunting season that I guess was just like 3 weeks in December or something like that. So how can emotionally driven narratives like unintentionally oversimplify complex ecological systems?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I have mixed feelings about that bear hunt. I never thought it was going to be a threat to the viability of the black bear population. However, I don't know if politically it was very smart, because polls show that something like 85% of Floridians were opposed to the hunt. So it's kind of like the wildlife agency kind of just shoving it in everybody's face. And the problem in Florida, and they were using, well, the bears are overpopulated now in many areas. It's not the bears that are overpopulated. It's humans that are overpopulated. So that's why I have mixed feelings. I don't think the hunt, did any damage. I didn't take a side on the hunt. I think, again, it was politically a little insensitive because most people were opposed to it. And it is not true that bears are overpopulated. It's what's happened is humans have moved into bear habitat. Now, sometimes individual bears do need to be taken out, if they're, especially when they hurt people or kill their pets. But a lot of the other problems, like getting into garbage, those can be fixed with non-lethal means. We can live with bears. Bears are common in many neighborhoods in Florida, and some counties now require bear management policies, such as bear-proof garbage cans. And the incidents, the conflicts go way down. I mean, way, way down. If bears don't have a source of food or garbage from humans, they lose interest in coming into human neighborhoods for the most part. It's because we've moved into their habitat, and then we've put out these tasty things for them to eat. That's why we have the conflict.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not opposed to the hunt in terms of the bear population. I think they only killed like 52 bears, a lot less than expected. But because of, these issues I just brought up, I just didn't want to take a side. I had some reporters want to get some statements from me. I said, it's not an issue I want to get into. I'm interested in the long-term bear population viability. And the hunt is not a threat to that. The threat to that is development. It's too many people.
Absolutely.
And so that's what people need to understand. We're putting too many people packing too many people into the state, including into habitat where there's bound to be conflicts with wildlife.
Yeah. And let's dive deeper into that. The first part of it being the successes of the bear. So the black bear in the state of Florida was down to what I think a few hundred at one point, and now it's over 4,000.
Yes.
So there's been a major comeback with in terms of the black bear. Yeah.
And that's in large part due to Florida's conservation programs, including the kind of corridors that I and others have been pushing, starting with Larry Harris and me back in the 80s. And the state has protected tens of millions of acres, and we've secured a lot of these corridors. We have wildlife crossing structures on many of the highways that had the most mortality for bears and panthers and other wildlife. And so it's largely because of land acquisition and highway modifications that the bear population was able to recover to where it is today.
I see.
It's not. A part of it was maybe removing bears from, when I was in Florida in the 80s, the bear was still a game species. And then it was listed.
Mm-hmm.
And with listing of the bear, the population did increase, but not so much, again, because it wasn't hunted anymore, but rather because we started protecting more of its habitat. But now we've gotten to kind of a crunch. The bear population is not going to be able to grow much more unless we protect more habitat. And the bear population is still nothing what it was before Europeans colonized Florida. So it is a remarkable recovery, but we're still nowhere near the original, pre-settlement bear population. So we still have a way to go. Now, the panther was down to like around 20 individuals in the 1970s. Wow. Yeah, really low, right on the verge of extinction. And the main thing actually that brought the panther back to where it is, and now it's around, estimates are between 120 and 200, somewhere like that. So that's a big increase. But the main factor there was, we talked about genetics earlier. It was genetic rescue by bringing in some panthers from East Texas that had more genetic variability and releasing them in South Florida where they bred with the Florida panthers. And very quickly, the reproductive rate of the Florida panthers started shooting up because those panthers had undergone those two problems that I mentioned earlier: inbreeding depression, we call it, and also genetic drift, random loss of genes in very small populations. And so with that genetic rescue from Texas, we had a healthier panther population. There's still problems. And then we did start to put in wildlife crossings. There's dozens of crossings that have been put in specifically for panthers. And Interstate 75 was constructed in the early 90s across a road that's known as Alligator Alley. It crosses the Big Cypress and the Everglades in South Florida. Mm-hmm. About 30 some wildlife crossing structures were installed. And there's been more since then, including on other roads. And those wildlife crossings and associated fencing to funnel the animals into the crossings have done an amazing job at preventing a lot of panther deaths, though roadkill still is the largest source of panther mortality. And so there's a lot more we have to do in terms of reducing roadkill. Basically, a lot more wildlife crossings and more habitat protected.
That kind of feeds into the next point that I kind of wanted to make and ask you about. So like a lot of people assume that protecting wildlife just means leaving nature alone, which in some cases works. But from a scientific standpoint, like modern conservation often requires active management and like rather than non-intervention, like you were speaking on the wildlife crossings and, just having to do work in general in terms of conservation rather than just leaving it alone. And I feel like there's a misconception sometimes on both sides of it, from conservationists and from people that are animal activists, that they don't really understand how things get better because yes, historically animals did exist without humans and encroaching on their land. But we also aren't just going to say, okay, well, this whole 10,000 acre stretch where there's a bunch of houses now, y'all got to get out and just let wildlife take over. Like there has to be a balance to where we have to be able to manage it and do what we can as humans, because it's inevitable. People are going to be living in close proximity to animals, and we need to find a way to be able to allow the animals to have their space and thrive and grow their populations without just completely kicking humans out of the equation.
Absolutely. And again, this gets back to the rewilding issue. I mean, rewilding is, again, trying to put back together a complete ecosystem, a complete food web.
Mm-hmm.
Where ideally, rewilding, especially the wilderness end of the spectrum of rewilding, will create an ecosystem that is more or less autonomous, able to manage itself without direct human intervention. But that's not possible in most places. I mean, that end of the spectrum of rewilding is unfortunately only applicable to very small part now of North America. Well, especially of the United States, and especially the Eastern United States. There's very few areas. And so lacking that possibility, there is no other way that we can maintain wildlife without direct, scientifically informed human intervention. Things like wildlife crossings, things like population management, things like regulated hunting. All these things are necessary to maintain populations in a viable state where they don't become too abundant, but don't dwindle either. And oftentimes we have to move, like with the Texas cougar, we have to move animals from one population to another. If there aren't adequate corridors at the present time, we have to move animals and plants to prevent some of these problems with inbreeding and genetic drift.
Mm-hmm.
And that's all very active. I mean, it's expensive.
Yeah.
Wildlife crossing structures, even a very simple one, costs about $1 million.
Yep.
And some of the bigger ones can be tens of millions of dollars. And I forget, it's over $100 million, this one crossing that they just put in Southern California,
Really?
in the LA area. It's a huge crossing structure, and they had to put in, do some habitat restoration, a lot of fencing. But those can be successful, but you got to have a public that is willing to, pay taxes to support that kind of intervention. And mountain lions are popular, despite the fact that almost every year they kill somebody in California.
Yeah.
They're still very popular in California. Surprisingly, in Florida, the Florida panther is amazingly popular with the vast majority of the public. It's Florida's state animal. It was voted its state animal by school children, I think, way back in the 60s or 70s.
Really?
And so the public loves panthers. Not all ranchers love panthers, but there are a number who do, especially if they're compensated for any livestock losses, which they are.
I see.
And the same thing with wolves in the West. We have a lot of deep-seated predator prejudice, especially in people in rural landscapes, because they come from, in many cases, background of, frontier type of people where they were competing with large predators for prey, and they were sometimes prey themselves with large predators. So, grizzly bears, wolves, mountain lions were scary, and they were an economic liability. And so it's no wonder that we developed this prejudice, but we now know how to manage these populations and manage people where we don't necessarily, we can avoid those conflicts. And so there's really not a good excuse for predator prejudice anymore. But it's a hard thing, especially again with people in the wilder, more rural parts of the country, like Idaho and Wyoming, where they don't like wolves. I mean, I actually was on the board of a livestock company called Lava Lake Land and Livestock in Idaho for a number of years. They disbanded their board after a while. There's a smaller operation now, but these are people who raise sheep and cattle in the Pioneer Mountains of Idaho, very wild area. Part of their grazing leases actually extended into the Craters of the Moon National Monument. Beautiful area. We'd have our board meetings camping out in the wilderness, basically. But
really,
they had losses by wolves of their sheep, especially. In one case, a pack of wolves came in and killed 30-something sheep.
Wow.
But these guys, these people, this couple that owns the company, they love wolves anyway. And so they've developed fladry, which are flagging that wolves don't like, these these flags waving. For some reason, it scares them. It brought in Peruvian sheep herders who know how to manage, the sheep in a way to avoid predation. And so it takes more money, it takes more intensive management, but they were able to sustain a livestock business despite losses to wolves.
I
And
see.
they were willing to lose some because they love the wolves.
Yeah.
But they're kind of a minority,
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's one thing. It's a circle of life. It's like that you have to, if you're going to be, which going back to some of the pitfalls of capitalism is everybody wants to squeeze every bit of money they can out of what they have. And I think it's just a societal thing, but a lot of people don't want to lose anything. But in my opinion, that's just a part of life. Like nothing is perfect. There's going to be, no matter what you're doing, there's going to be some little tiny bit of loss, no matter what. And so I think people just need to have a better understanding of that. And like you said, even if they have to do certain things to mitigate or to manage certain things, in the case of, the sheep, that they did something to do it, and it took more money, took more effort. And I think a lot of people just don't want to put that money or effort in order to help with conservation. And, not to talk too much on the bear hunting season thing, but to go back towards that, there was a lot of hoopla about it, and a lot of activists actually went and bought. Weren't they like buying the?
They bought the tags too.
Yeah, they're trying to buy tags, and I think a lot of them didn't truly understand what exactly they were doing, which it benefited conservation. So,
Yes.
I mean, I think there was over 160,000 applications put in for tags. No matter how many were put in, they were only going to draw 172 permits. So. All those people going in and doing that actually helped conservation kind of in a backwards way that they may not have been their intention. They're really doing it to try to drown out the amount of hunters that would actually go hunt the bears. But they actually did a favor for us. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. Not all hunters feel that way, but yeah, I think so. It's, I am not an animal rights type of person. I think a lot of their premises are wrong. I think, they focus on so-called sentient animals, which are, self-conscious, aware animals. But the way they define it, it's those that have a consciousness that's most similar to humans. So it's actually very anthropocentric, very human-centered. I once had an argument with some animal rights people who said, well, we don't care about reptiles, amphibians, they're not sentient. I said, well, they're actually just as important to the ecosystem as the sentient animals that you care about, and plants are just as important. So, I personally love plants as much as I love animals. So there's a lot of bias in the animal rights movement. Although on some issues, I do agree with them. In the past, some of my work on the Florida panther was supported by the Humane Society of the U.S. And it didn't have anything to do with hunting. It had to do with wildlife corridors. And so some of the animal rights crowd, construed broadly, are smart enough to know that habitat and movement corridors and that kind of thing are the main issue. It's not hunting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it is an interesting dichotomy that, us as conservationists, we love these animals. But me personally, I'm not opposed to harvesting. And there's an understanding that you do have to harvest sometimes.
Yes.
But you were just talking about the sentience, how they see them as sentient animals. Not only are they seeing them, personifying these animals, but they're also looking at it almost on like an individualistic scope. They're not looking at the broader picture for the species. If you're not hunting a certain animal, you're going to have overpopulation, or if it's a predator, you're going to have higher levels of predation for other species. And it's a big ecological picture that I feel like a lot of people probably don't understand, or they don't care to think that way. They just want to act on emotion, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with, acting on emotions, but there has to be a fine balance to where there's an understanding of how ecology works and how species relate to one another. And that there are decades of studies and data that have been collected in order to preserve these things. And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there. And I'm hoping that I can, assist in trying to bridge that gap. And hopefully we have some listeners that aren't hunters and anglers that can actually get something from this episode. But with that being said, I greatly appreciate, your knowledge and expertise on a lot of these things, and being willing to answer the questions that I've had for you.
And it's, I am not a hunter myself. I have gone hunting with friends years ago. A lot of my good friends are hunters. I love to eat the meat that they share with me. Yeah. But I do have, problems with some hunters.
Mhm.
Not all hunters are ethical. We have to
Yeah,
recognize
absolutely.
that too. There's a lot of slob hunters, but there's a lot of ethical hunters, and so I have nothing at all against ethical hunting. And again, even if not even considering that, as we've discussed, hunting is often a very critical management tool to prevent overpopulation
Mhm.
and prevent
Absolutely.
damage to the ecosystem.
And I'm glad that you spoke on ethical hunters, because there's a lot of people that I've met, and I disagree with a lot of the reasons. I mean, they hunt for meat, which is great. If you're going to hunt, I think you should utilize what you harvest.
Yes,
But there's people that say this is, God's land, and we have dominion over it, and I don't need to pay the government to do this. And I kind of understand that mindset. But at the
yeah,
same time, you need to I feel like those people need to understand that they are benefiting the conservation of, wildlife in general as a whole by purchasing these licenses and getting these tags and whatever the case may
exactly.
be, buying their ammo and scopes and guns and anything to do with that form of recreation. There's a tax that goes directly to assist that. And, there's just people that I feel like, hunter or not, just don't understand how a lot of this
Yeah,
works.
and that said, I do think, and everybody, hunter and non-hunter, should go out of the way to show compassion
For
and to
sure.
avoid causing unnecessary suffering. I think that's important. I mean, the population is more important than the individual, and the
Absolutely.
ecosystem is more important than the population, but individuals are important too. I don't like to see any animal suffer. I want to, if I'm going to eat an animal, and I do fish. I don't fish as much as I used to, but when I kill a fish, I want to kill it quickly and ethically. I don't want it to suffer. It just suffering bothers me. So I don't want to see
Same.
it.
Same.
So, I think we all have a responsibility to do as much as we can to minimize suffering.
Absolutely. And just being a good steward of what we have that's awarded to us. And,
Exactly.
that's something, here in America that is different than a lot of the other countries, where we have the rights to be able to harvest what we do. And there's a lot of other countries that don't have that. So
Exactly.
I definitely think we should be good stewards of what we have.
Yes, I agree.
But other than that, I mean, I think this is a good way to close it out. And I truly do appreciate your time and appreciate your expertise and knowledge on these. And yeah, if people are looking to get a hold of you, is there a link that I can give them to find you, or any articles that you'd like to promote?
Well, I don't have a link handy, but I work half time for the University of Florida Center for Landscape Conservation Planning, which
Okay.
has a website.
Okay.
And so that is the best way to learn about what I and my colleagues are doing. And it's easy to find, just Center for Landscape Conservation Planning at University of Florida. Um, and people can also Google me and probably find my contact information pretty easily.
Okay. Awesome. Well,
So
I'll make sure I put the link that you mentioned in the description so they can go find
that
out
would be
more
great.
about what y'all are doing there.
Cool.
And other than that, those of y'all that are watching to the end, I appreciate it. Please share, like, subscribe, tell somebody to watch this, and we'll catch y'all next time.
This has been Wildlife Outdoors. Thanks for listening. Follow us on Facebook at Wildlife Outdoors and on Instagram at wild.life.outdoors. Let's go live life on the wild side.